All right, it's a Friday night, and Ted, we are still close to starting on time, although
All right,
uh,
we're doing good.
we aren't live streaming anymore because how Facebook has changed things. It's a little harder to live stream, but we'll post this right when we're done. And tonight we've got a special guest. We've got Dr. Todd Jones from UNLV, and we're all both wearing our UNLV gear. This is great, and he's in the Department of Philosophy. Hey, Todd, how are you?
I'm very good. Good to be
Awesome.
here.
What's that?
I don't usually get to talk, about sports with other philosophers, and I don't usually get to talk philosophy with other sports people. So it's nice to be here.
I know it's so great how we connected, and because we are in very different departments, and so our departments hardly ever connect with each other. But somehow we were
Never do
able,
it.
yeah, to find each other, and I'm like, oh, this would be great to dive into a little bit more about what you do, and so I'm really excited about this. But I do need to mention the three of us do have something in common in that we all had a bike crash in 2024.
Yeah.
And I'm so glad.
Around the same time.
Yeah, around the same time. So I don't know what it was, but I'm glad you're doing well. Ted's doing well. I'm doing well. So scary stuff, but I think we all agree helmets are probably really important. They are important, not probably. Well, Todd, I know your background is running, and we'll help you with some of the triathlon talk as we go through. But your running background is pretty amazing, and what the work you do as a researcher is interesting as well. Do you want to give us a little bit of your academic background and just maybe a big picture of what you do research-wise?
Yeah. It's I probably it might be easier to to start with a sports stuff because that sort of moves into it. Like in basically, I mean, what we do in philosophy is collect as much sort of empirical data and common sense ideas as possible and see if we can construct it into an argument, right? To make some claim and see if it's true, right? So in sports, all kinds of questions sort of arise that are philosophical like that, like what is and isn't fair. Is it not fair if somebody gets a new shoes that are more cushioned? There's philosophical questions like, do you want to, what makes one athlete really better than another? Can you compare athletes from different sports? What's physical and what's mental? And these were all things that I always sort of thought about, in a sports. I've been, sort of running competitively and seriously since I was 12. And those questions sort of always came up to me. I eventually got a PhD in philosophy, and I'm like, well, I'm still interested in those questions.
I love it.
So and this is so awesome too, because I think we all think about these things, or
Yeah.
at least people that are competing in sports or even watching sports, right?
Right.
So the one that always comes to my mind, and I know you have some work in this, is this whole thought process behind, what's the word I'm looking for? Kind of like mental toughness and grit and determination. And that's one side of things, right? But then you have the other side that actually you have to have skill and you have to be prepared and you have to have trained, for example. So you can't take, for example, let's say we did a marathon. We can't take somebody that's never trained. Doesn't matter how hard mentally they are, right? Or how tough they are. If they haven't trained, they're not going to run a 3-hour marathon. Right. So there has to be a balance between these two things, right? So the actual training fitness level but also mental toughness and resiliency. So can you help maybe wrap our heads around that in the work that you've done and finding this balance?
Right. So it's really an interesting question because it's one of the things athletes talk about like all the time is like, oh, how can I be mentally tough? How can I be more mentally agile? How can I have more grit? In a way that's like, this is something different than physical. But what's hard and confusing about that is, in a sense, everything is physical because it's the brain telling everything to happen, and it's a physical brain happening. On the other side, everything is mental because the body doesn't move anywhere like without the brain like telling it to. So teasing out what you count as physical and what you count as mental to begin with is hard, right? It seems to be roughly a kind of division between, the mental is what sends out various kinds of steering signals, And the physical is the stuff that responds to those steering signals, right? And then a question would be like, well, how can you get better in the mental part? And I think you can kind of divide the mental part into a formula that I call like the DC COP formula, that we want to somehow get an increased desire, D, increased confidence, C, being able to, here's the COP part, C, circumvent, or O, overcome, or P, not overcome, but persevere. And it's good to try to figure out, are there any strategies by which you can improve in those, I guess that's 5 things.
Yeah.
And that's what sort of mental toughness is about, I think.
Okay. So that's a lot that you just
Yeah.
gave us. So can we break down those 5 things kind of one by one? Is that possible? Can you
Sure.
do that for us in the context of an endurance sport?
Yeah. So there's a whole lot of physical stuff that you can do that can make you better, right? You can get a higher VO2 max or better than a lactate threshold, or a more flexible or more efficient in lactating, all kinds of things, right? So we put all that to one side and say, all right, let's imagine people can get better at that. Now I want us to think about how I can get better mentally. Okay. Now the DC COP again is, you're going to be better mentally if you have more of a desire for something. The stronger the desire you're going to have, other things equal. If I just take somebody who's a clone of me, if the clone of me has my physical abilities and all, but I have more desire for this or that in the sport, like to beat that person or to finish a certain time, I'm going to do better. So that's the desire. Now, desire really needs the C, that sort of confidence, the belief that you can do it. Mike Tyson, I think, had the best expression about this once. He said, everybody's got a plan until they get punched in the face. And he goes, well, you've got to like actually be sure, like, I'm going to be able to take a lot of pain, or various bad things can happen, but I know I'm going to be okay, right? If you don't have that, you can't do very well mentally. So the desire, right, and the confidence you need. Okay. Then you start working on the nitty-gritty of what are the obstacles that you're going to face. And there are physical obstacles, but there are mental obstacles. Most of the mental obstacles, I think, are pain, fear, fatigue, and distraction. I'd say those are your main mental obstacles you're going to have in a sport. And so then you got to think, what can I do about that? Because those things are going to slow me down, right? They're going to degrade my performance, right? Fear, pain, fatigue, and distraction. So I can think of 3 ways I can deal with them. One is to try to go around them and circumvent them, do something so I'm not going to feel that, right? Maybe if I cut back my stride, I won't feel that kind of pain there. Or if I squeeze myself on the side, that's going to make the pain go away. It's just going to be gone. I could circumvent it. Okay. Different from circumventing is overcoming it. There's something I can actually do to make it go away. Like, oh, my stomach really hurts, but if I chant this thing, I think about the chant and the stomach hurt is gone. The P is persevere, when you pretty much say, all right, nothing I can do to get rid of this pain or fatigue. It's there, but how can I keep going while I've got that? And there might be various strategies that make you better at that or not. Now, one other thing I'll say about them is I found it's actually very hard to get good at any of those things.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. All right. So I love this. Oh, I want to follow. I think we're both jumping at the bit here, because this is really, so DCOP. So
DC COP. So 2 C's there. DC COP.
2 C. Okay. So desire, circumvent, confidence.
Desire, confidence, circumvent, overcome, persevere.
All right. I'm trying to take good notes here. This is really good. Overcome. Okay. I like this framework of trying to put mental skills in these bins. How do you now work that in from a race perspective, or how do you work this into training so you can apply it during a race?
Yeah, no, that's a very good question. Is how do you train this? Is because now one thing I'll say, and one thing I've decided in, so it's now, I started racing pretty competitively at 12, and I'm 62 now, so it's been 50 years. And one of the things I've worked on a whole lot during those 50 years is how to do those mental things, and I've not been very successful. I have two sons who were both very good runners. I tried to work those things, and there's stuff around the margins you can do. But it's really hard to do them. So the first thing I guess I'll say is, when all is said and done, there's no substitute for being more fit in any one of the ways of fitness. You know, and you just here what your body is doing, I think, is it's giving you signals that that it's evolved to do, like you're damaging it in a bad way. You're doing something that is damaging your body. So you better slow down. That's the fatigue. You better stop it to stop the pain. You better watch out for be afraid. It's giving you these signals that you're supposed to do. And what's very, very hard is to figure out, okay, how do I stop those signals? What's much better is if you never get those things in the first place. So if you can do anything that has better conditioning where you don't feel those things, I think that's going to be more successful than anything you can do that. Okay, so that being said, there are some things around the margins you can do, but the fitness, I think, is key. Now, around the margins, what I've done is try to do things like, probably the thing that you can be most successful in, I'd say, is the perseverance, right? Because that's a matter of kind of almost doing operant conditioning on yourself that, all right, this really hurts, but you're kind of used to this. Like you're going to have this, and it's not going to hurt you, and it's not going to kill you. And so if you do something that over and over and over again, the last 50 meters, it's really going to hurt, but you do 12 quarters where you just do that the last 50 meters, you'll get more used to that persevering. So that's one of the things you can actually train. Now, what would be really interesting is and why people I think are so interested in mental toughness is we want there to be things you can do in real time, where you can tell somebody in a second, if you think this way, you'll be different, right? And there are people who might find that. They might find that there's a particular song that they start humming in their head. They can overcome the pain. It's gone. So I would sort of encourage everybody, look and trial and error and see if you can find those for yourself. And maybe you find you can't, right? But I think those are the things to try. See if there's anything you can do to increase your desire. See if there's anything you can do to increase your confidence. See if there's any circumvention or overcoming or persevering.
Love that.
I love the desire talk. Like John and I, we race a lot, and I don't know, John. I'm going to ask John a question really quick. John, when you race a triathlon, what's your desire?
Oh, that's an interesting question. Yeah, I guess it goes to why do we race?
Right.
We often, my desire, I guess, is I just want to push myself to limits. That's what I've always enjoyed doing, is finding that red line of, whatever, of swimming, biking, or running, just finding that red line, maybe taking the risk that you're going over it. But I like finding that. Yeah.
I think it's a really interesting question. I think if we were to ask, 10 endurance athletes that exact question, like, what's the desire when you race? I think we'd get many different answers. Todd, obviously you've talked to people about this. What are you some of the answers you get to that question as far as desire?
So, one of the things that coaches really want to do, and that's all about motivating their athletes. The athletes already want to win, but the coach wants to tell them something that gives them a stronger desire.
Right.
If you'll win, you get this, right? And there's not a lot you can point to, right? That if you win, you get this, or if you do this time, you'll get this. So one of the things I sort of try to point to, and when I try to encourage people and talk to other people about doing that, is there's a tremendous amount of pride you get at meeting your goals And so that if you think about that, that when you get this, you're not going to get much. You're not going to get money. You're not going to get physical stuff. But there is a certain amount of pride you'll get. And you know that if you've done it before and if you've done it well. And so think about that and think about the fact that you'll get that, right? And if you think, there's a person right ahead of you, you're like, why should I try to pass them? This is going to hurt me. It's like, remember, pride is really important, and that pride stays with you. And that's one of the things that's been critically established, that people who become proud because of things they did, that helps them in all kinds of aspects of their life.
I love that answer. Oh my gosh. That just made so much sense to me. And just in my own journey and why I race, I never really thought about it like that.
Mm-hmm.
It is a pride thing.
Yeah.
And I think also that pride can go forward into other facets of your life, right. Yeah. And make other facets of your life better. Yeah. Right? The pride of doing well in a race, yes, that's something, but the pride is like, I trained hard, I obtained my goal, and that shows that I can do this in other facets of my life. And that was
yeah,
really...
no, there's all kinds of clinical work on that people live longer, they sleep better. In fact, let's see, here's a book by Jessica Tracy, right, about sort of the pride and the benefits of pride, and it's astounding how many. And that's not surprising, because evolution would wire us up to do that, to be like, we're not just looking for pleasure, we're looking for things we do that we're proud of, because if we do that, we're going to do all kinds of things to help ourselves and help the tribe in the long run. So I think we sort of evolved to get pride, and it helps us do things in the long run, and then that just is good for us all around. So I think you're right, you get pride from this other area in the endurance athlete world, and it will carry over to all kinds of other areas.
Well, it's interesting you mentioned pride, because one of the things that we talk about on this podcast and within our club is that we always think triathlon should be bringing value to the athlete, but then also bringing value to others around you. Mm-hmm. And so that's a neat perspective of pride relative to the tribe.
Yeah, right. Pride, usually the things you're proud of are things that help everyone, mm-hmm. not just you. Mm-hmm. So, now I think the very most interesting thing about desire is there's a lot of research that indicates you can't really change people's desires that much. The desires are, you can change your sub desires, like your sub goals, like here's something else I might do to get that goal, but your sort of top level goals, mm-hmm. They're pretty set. It's pretty mm-hmm. hard to change them. So if one of the things that if someone doesn't care, let's say, about competing, right? They don't care if they want to beat anyone. They want to do their best time. They want to run well. They want to have a good time, but they don't care about beating. There's very little you can say to them to make them care about that. Now, one of the reasons that's kind of interesting to me is I think that's right. For the most part, you can't change people's desires. And fortunately, most of the people who are in sports, they already have the desires you want to have to begin with, right? But sometimes they don't. Like, so when I was 12, I had the national best time in the marathon. I was really, a very surprisingly good runner. Mm-hmm. But had no competitiveness. So for the first 2 years of my cross country and track sort of career, I'd win half the races and lose half the races. I would run with anybody who was around, like to run with. And if there was nobody around, I'd win the race. And if there was somebody who was somewhere close to as good, I would lose, because we'd run and they would outkick me in the sprint, because I didn't really care. That wasn't that, it didn't matter to me. I was there for the camaraderie and the fun and whatnot. And between my sophomore and my junior year, I had a college friend who was a good runner, and we trained in the summer, and he decided that I was completely wasting my potential at running, because I did have a sort of a lot of talent. I could run, for instance, 5:10 per mile for 10 miles then. So I was quite good, but I was losing like all the time. And he's like, yeah, this is bad. So when we trained, he would taunt me. Like we would run, he'd say, hey, let's race to this tree. And I'm like, okay. And we go to the tree and he would beat me. And he was like, you're supposed to be this big famous runner. You're supposed to be this local celebrity. You're nothing. I can beat you anytime. And the next day we do it and he'd do the same thing. And he would do it again and again and again and again. And at one point, I just got so furious. And I tapped into a kind of deep reservoir of kind of rage I'd had because I was a terrible athlete at all kinds of sports. It was the 70s, so I was the smallest kid in the class, and that meant you get picked on by the biggest kid in the class all the time. So I had years and years and years of sort of being bullied, and I had like years of being sort of dismissed as a wimp because I wasn't good at other sports. I was only good at running, and that came to fore like in the just rage. So I said, "You want to race at that tree now? Come on, it's on." And he couldn't do it. He couldn't beat me, and he couldn't beat me ever again that race. And then the next 2 years, nobody could beat me ever. I went 4 undefeated seasons after that. That was an interesting time because my desires really did completely change. Now, I wouldn't recommend that as the way to sort of coach people, but it's interesting that desire changing is possible under weird circumstances.
Wow, that's such a good story. And and I think that many athletes with desire, they need to find the thing if they really want to race.
Yeah.
And not just and there's nothing wrong with the other side either of just enjoying the camaraderie and like that's completely fine as well. But if they want to race and they want to win a national championship or whatever the case may be, they do have to have desire. Would you agree that to be at the high level, desire has to be there?
Yeah, because if you're doing something really well in an endurance sport, you're hurting yourself.
Yeah.
You're pain. I mean, this is something a lot of people don't understand, I think, about endurance sports. Like my parents didn't understand it. My father was a multi-sport athlete at everything. He was good at everything. He played basketball. He played tennis. He was a bowler. He was a baseball semi-pro pitcher. And sports were just fun to him. Endurance sports are kind of a pain contest, which is like you're hanging on to the chin-up bar and the guy next to you is too, and you're both really hurting, and the person who lets go first loses. So if you don't have a really strong desire to sort of meet those goals, all those obstacles I talked about, the pain, fatigue, the fear, they're going to stop you.
Interesting. Well, and what's interesting, your story is going from a desire not necessarily to win, but to enjoy, yes, and then switching to having the desire to win. And we have athletes in our club and who are listening to this that they enjoy just going and completing an event. And then you have those who really enjoy competing for an event. And what's interesting, Ted, you asked me what's my desire. Well, that has been my desire, but now because of injury and some health issues, I have to change my desire to be complete versus compete. So I don't know. Any tip for now? I'll ask a selfish question. How do I change my desire from competing to completing?
I'm going to think a lot about that. That's a really good question because the kinds of ways I've been coming at it before have always been ways of especially working with my son. My older son was very much like me. He was very, very good runner. He had the fastest time in the state in 2018, but he had no competitiveness. So I was trying to figure out how can I get him to care about this, right? And other people on his team too. I would talk to them how do I get them to go from less desire to win to more? I haven't thought about it the other way. How do you go from more to less, or to just different? And I mean, in some ways, I've done that. I haven't raced at all in years and years and years, and I'm very happy running. So I guess I've gotten to a point where just running is happy. So I sort of though I suppose if I did jump into a race, I would be very upset if I wasn't ahead. So that desire is still in there. So that's a good question. I do think it's probably easier to go from a kind of a desire for a very hard thing to a desire for a less hard thing is easier than the other way. But I'm going to think about that. Thank you. I mean, that gives me something to think about. Is yeah, that kind of desire change.
It's not easy.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
along that
Because
line,
you feel like you're missing out
Right.
on what your enjoyment was before, and so
Right.
even just the training for an event is different now than before. So, anyways,
Yeah.
that's my selfish question. So, thank
Yeah.
you. That's
No, I'm gonna write that down to think about that. Yeah.
I think that's really good, and there's something that maybe I'm going to ask a little bit of the selfish question as well, and it's not selfish because I think we're all dealing with this. But what are your thoughts on endurance athletes tend to compete across their lifespan? Right? It's a long-term thing. Like you said, you started running when you were a kid. You're still running. John got into triathlon 40 years ago. Like I started doing endurance sports when I was in high school. So how does the identity of being a competitive athlete evolve as athletes age and maybe their physical abilities change? So like whether it's an injury or life gets in the way, they don't have the time to train or whatever like that. What are your thoughts around that? Or and I'm sure you've done this. You've thought about this as well because your own journey.
Yeah. So I've I thought a lot about competitiveness, and I'll back up a long way because this is
Please.
one of the first sort of where I started kind of doing philosophy of sport was in those sort of my junior and senior year in cross country and track. There was really I didn't just win. I won by maybe 100 meters every race, right? And so people often said that Jones is incredibly competitive. Jones really, really, he likes to compete, and he likes just to drive people into the ground. Now, my father was also called incredibly competitive because anytime he just did a pickup sport he never did before, he would try to win. But we were incredibly different because my father wanted it to be as close as possible. He was never as happy as when he was playing deuce in tennis over and over and over, or when it was a tiebreaker in tennis. And if he and I would race in sprinting, and he would want to win by inches. I was competitive because I didn't want anyone near me. I was afraid like that I would actually have to compete in a mano-a-mano way with another guy. I didn't want to do that. I was too worried about that. So I stayed so far ahead just because I didn't want that. And so one question was like, okay, how are we both competitive? When he wants it as close as possible, and that makes him competitive, but I don't want it anywhere near, and that makes me competitive. And I found out there is a core to competitiveness, but then there's enormous amount of variability around that. So the core is you want to beat somebody else who is also doing the same thing as you. That's what all competitive people want to do. If you're a marathoner, you are trying to keep a pace, right? And you're watching it and you're saying, I want to go 6:15 a mile. And you watch that and people are going by you right and left. And you're really glad that you hit your splits. You're not competitive. Like, competitive people want to beat other people. It's not just excellence. You want to beat other people. I mean, wanting excellence is one thing, but competitiveness, I think, is always about beating other people. All right. Now, why this is ambiguous and unclear is like you have this strong desire to beat other people, but strength, what does that mean, a strong desire? Is it duration? Is it intensity? Or is it frequency of thinking about this? And your desire, is it your dispositions? Is it how you feel? Is it how you label it? Those can all be different. And then who are the other people? And what does it mean to beat them? Like, who are the other people? I think as we get older, we think of people our own age. Like, if we beat them, then we won, right? We don't think about the first guy. We think about those people. But who the people are can change. So for one competitive person, what they're trying to beat is different than another competitive person, or what it means to beat. I mean, Steve Prefontaine famously said, the race, it's not a matter of who wins the race. It's a matter of who got out to the front and ran themselves into the ground until they had nothing left. So if he did that, but somebody else was ahead of him by outkicking him, he's like, well, he didn't win. He just dragged behind me and dragged the win. That's not really a win. What I did was a win. And he really meant that. He really believed that. Beating people, what does that mean? It can mean something different. all the time, right? Robert Simon, who is a philosopher of sport, often watched a lot of playground athletes playing basketball, and they consider to win the people who could do the most impressive moves on the other team, even if they didn't score the most. So competitiveness, you want to beat other people, but what beating is can vary, and who the other people are can vary.
I love that. And what's interesting about triathlon, I'll be interested in your thoughts on this. That's poster behind me says the greatest opponent, it will be yourself. And what's interesting in triathlon is the way that the race develops. For our larger races, they start 3 or 4 people at one time. And then everyone goes, 5 seconds after each other. And so when you're racing someone, either on the bike or even the swim or the run, you may be right next to someone, but you have no idea where you are relative to when they started. And so that person may be next to you, but you may be well ahead of them on time because you started at a different time than they did, or vice versa. And so that competitiveness, I don't know how that changes.
Right, because there are certain people you want to beat, but you don't necessarily know who they are.
You don't know who they are, and you don't know where they are in the race that you're running because everyone started at a different time.
So I'm curious with that, because triathlons are really different because people are so spread out in triathlon, much more they are in a track race. So if you are somebody who's competitive and you're concerned with, there are some people you want to beat, how do you know? What do you do? I'm asking both of you.
Yeah, you have to wait until afterwards, or if you really want to be competitive and get on the podium, and you're worried about where you are throughout the race, you have someone who's spotting for you, a spectator, and then they have to give you information along the way. Hey, you're in this position or that position, but physically you don't know where you are relative to each other. But you can look on some different apps and you can figure out where roughly you are position wise.
Yeah, it's much really more involved thing.
It can really mess with you when the person messes it up.
Yeah.
I've had that before. Someone's like, "Hey, you're in 4th place," and I'm like, "Oh man," I better push to make get to the podium, and then actually I was in 11th.
Yeah.
But it's interesting how the desire changes, right? I did push harder to get this potential podium place because of the information and the information being wrong. And then I was thinking about this, well, wow, that's quite an interesting motivator, right? Actually having false information given to you. And
that would be related to the sort of confidence. Like, I think I can actually get that. You're not going to go through all of that pain if you're like only going to end up 9th, right? But if you get a 3rd, right. It's worth it. You've got that confidence. But I'm also curious, are there triathletes that consider like winning, having the best at one of the 3? Like, so somebody might say like, yeah, I know I'm a terrible swimmer, and I finished 9th overall, but I was the fastest biker. Are there people that care about that?
This is actually a problem in the sport. Is a lot of people want to have the fastest bike split, but they get the fastest bike split, but then they can't run.
Right.
And so then they lose the race overall or position wise. But no, there is, I always take pride in coming out, in the, top people for the swim segment. And I know Ted is a strong runner. He always has a great run segment.
So I imagine that's a case where you got that sort of variability, what it means to beat someone, right? It's like, you didn't pass them. Like, yeah, but that's just because I can't run, and big deal. Yeah, it's fastest bike that matters, right? Like, so yeah, you do sort of, you're still very competitive, but you can pick and choose what it means to beat someone.
Mm-hmm.
Doesn't necessarily mean to pass them. It could mean doing a better bike, or it could mean doing a better swim. Yeah.
Okay, I want to switch it a little bit and talk about, and we talked about fatigue and fear and pain, and so John and I often talk about fatigue and what fatigue is, and we went back and forth of like trying to identify what fatigue is. So I know you've done some work on this as well. So can we talk about the differences in your mind and thought process around mental fatigue versus physical fatigue?
Okay, that's a good question. Now, so I mean,
Or is there a
a
difference?
lot of a lot of the what I would sort of call mental fatigue is physical fatigue, right? So I mean, a lot of where you've got a mental problem, right, is your body actually could keep going. It could go faster. It's possible, but your mind is saying, "Don't do that. Don't do that. Do that." So I would, for the most part, say fatigue is a mental obstacle that's there. So somebody, I mean, there are some people that like when they touch a hot stove, they don't feel anything. There are people who feel very little fatigue, right? So and they don't have that mental obstacle. So they're lucky. It gives them an advantage. Now, I suppose there is something in addition that you could call mental fatigue, which is you're tired of certain mental things happening over and over and over and over again. You don't want to, you're tired of this road. It's really bothering you. Or you're tired of how far this guy goes. Or you're tired of watching the guy's heels in front of you, something. So I would say that, first, I guess I would generally think all fatigue is a kind of mental obstacle, but a subtype of that fatigue mental obstacle would be not the kind caused by the muscles, but the kind caused by certain internal mental things happening. So yeah, you can have that kind of fatigue as well. And I imagine in triathlons, you really have it because it's so many hours.
And I guess discounting like where you literally collapse, right? Yeah. Where your body, like you go unconscious and collapse. I mean, that is truly physical fatigue.
Yeah.
So then,
right.
When we think about this mental fatigue, because it does happen in these longer events, right? Like we talked about it offline, like maybe you're out there for 12 hours, 14 hours. Do you know, like, have you any thought process around like how you overcome that kind of mental fatigue?
Well, that's a really good question, because I was a high school, I was a college athlete, and my kids were high school athletes. And one thing that occurred to me sometimes is, well, one problem you might have is boredom. But like, no, at a high school, any kind of high school sport, there's not boring. It's really in the triathletes that you really have the kind of boredom and repetition and things like that. So it's not anything I have any experience with or have thought about. But I'm glad now that I could start thinking that, because that is going to be a problem for certain kinds of sports, especially triathletes.
So some of the courses lead to it as well, right? So it could be like on in an Ironman, the bike is 112 miles. So you're looking at 4.5 to maybe 6 hours.
Right.
And there's some courses that are kind of notorious. They're like on a motorway, like or on an interstate or highway. They're like an out and back. It's flat. It's pretty boring. Like I personally have no desire to do those. I want to do a race that's got some mountains. It's got some hills, and there's different scenery and different things to look at. And to me, that's not boring at all. And and I've done both types, and the mental fatigue is way higher when it's a boring road that you're riding on. And it's the same in the run, right? It's boring highway we're just running down, versus we just did a race in New Zealand, and the run was spectacular because there's this beautiful lake, there's a volcano in the background, and there were so many fans. And everyone was cheering you. There wasn't 1 second that it was boring. Right. And I don't know about you, John, but I was so much more mentally engaged because of where we were. And so I think maybe one of the things that I think about this with the athletes I coach, and we start looking at courses and races they're going to do, is it an easier course because it's like flat and there's not a lot of topography or whatever physically, but maybe mentally it's harder.
Well, let me see how I'm doing as a student here, because I'm learning a lot on this. Does that discussion about distraction actually fall in Circumvent in your DC COP mental skills framework? Like if you're distracted from the task of pedaling, in this case, or running.
Right. So just distraction is always going to be a detractor, right? And to figure out, there are some distractions that are good, right? Because it takes away from the pain and fatigue, or you can distract yourself. But a lot of times, distraction is, if you're playing tennis and you hear somebody that's booing you and you can't stop thinking about that, that's going to be really bad. And there can be, people in the stands that you're in a track race that distractive, and that's bad. So there's that kind of bad distraction. But what I'm hearing about is this sort of new thing, which is actually a kind of like just boredom, and the fact that the painful things have gone on and on and on and on and on and on and on, which is different than the pain itself. But it's like the continuation of it, right? And on my DC cop, I still think you want to do it the same way. You'd really say, I want the desire to be there, so I keep going anyway. I want the confidence to be there, so I can keep doing anyway. Now let's see if there's a way I can circumvent this. One way I can circumvent it is picking courses, right, that aren't boring, and I won't feel that. Another way would be the sort of overcome way, which is, and this is what I try to do on some of my longer runs, is I have a philosophy problem or something in my class that I don't know how I'm going to explain, and I sit there and I try to think about it, and then I'm not bored at all. I mean, it's overcoming all of the sort of pain and boredom and anything that might be there. They're not there because I've completely switched my mind to that. Persevering would be a matter of like, I've learned how to just take it. Like, yeah, this sucks, but I can do it.
Mm-hmm. Oh, I love it. Well, what's interesting about this part of the discussion is a lot of the research from a biomechanics or physiology perspective uses an experimental model that involves time to exhaustion test. Mm-hmm. That is, keep running until you, like Ted said, you collapse, you're exhausted, you can't keep going. Okay. And part of the limitation of that type of experiment is that's not how we race.
Yeah.
We don't race for time, although we race for distance and try to do it as fast as possible. And so this has always been a problem with some of the fatigue research, is that it's not always applicable to real world situations because of this time to exhaustion type of test.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. I mean, because that's just very few. I mean, that's, you really, even the best Olympic athletes, they're doing a victory lap after a marathon. They're not exhausted.
And what's interesting is I've done a lot of running type fatigue research, and I've always had to define it for reviewers. Have to define fatigue as a decrease in force capability and all this type of stuff. But really, what I learned to define fatigue as, and this aligned with what you're talking about, it's a perception of how much more you can do.
Yeah, I think that's right.
And if you start perceiving that you can't keep going, well, you're going to stop and slow down.
Right. And I think your brain is telling you that, like, I don't have that many reserves left. You better slow down. You better slow down. And what you're trying to do is trying to tell your brain to shut up. Somehow or other. What's better to do is you don't get it in the first place. You train to a point that you don't feel that fatigue, right? Yeah. But I think almost always that's what I used to ask various coaches, what can I do when I feel that fatigue? It's like, if you feel that fatigue, it's already too late.
Well, it's interesting. One of the worst races I've ever had is I succumbed to all those negative thoughts, and I could not get beyond them. And that's haunted me. Is that so it's actually good to hear that you don't want to get to that spot, because it is really difficult to get out of.
Yeah. That's and that was my focus for years, kind of as a master's athlete, is like, I know I can't get any faster, but what can I do so that pain doesn't bother me anymore? And I'm like, no, there's nothing you can do. The pain doesn't bother. It's always going to bother you. What you ought to do is get to the point where you don't get pain. There are a few things along the margins. Like, some people really might find that one song. If I hum that one song to myself, I'm not thinking about anything else, and the pain is gone. But you just have to find that for yourself, what that thing is. And you might not have one.
But I think you're right. Like, I think what we want to do is find that. And one of the things that you talked about with like confidence, your confidence might come from you knowing that you can get to that place, right? Yeah. You have a coping mechanism, because it's going to hurt. like we're gonna race this, next weekend or whatever, and if I'm gonna do well, I'm gonna be successful. It's gonna hurt, but I have a coping mechanism for that, and I'm confident that my coping mechanism is gonna work.
Yeah,
because I've done it before, and I think that's another big piece of this is the mental side is experience as well, right?
absolutely.
When you've done your 100th triathlon or your 100th marathon compared to your first or second marathon, your strategies around coping and are so much greater.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And it's a real problem with high school sports, because high school sports, you get all kinds of people who aren't confident, and coaches say, how can I get this person to be more confident by telling them something? But it's very rare that telling somebody something is going to make them more confident. And I've been around many, many, many high school athletes telling themselves, I'm going to win. I've got this. I got this. I've got this. Then you get into the Mike Tyson situation. Yeah, you think that's how you get punched in the face, right? You only really get confidence by doing it, and like, oh, I know I can do it. So yeah.
I love this. So, we all have students, right? And one of the issues I have with students is you will be talking and like, oh, I just have a lack of confidence. Like on the test, for example, like, why did you perform poorly? Oh, I just have a lack of confidence. Well, how do you gain confidence? And not just in endurance sports, but in life.
Yeah.
Right.
And it's almost a catch-22. You gain confidence by doing something well. But
exactly.
If you don't confident, it's hard to start doing anything else. You have to somehow start that positive cycle.
And that's a tough answer, because I've had students ask me that question, right? Well, how do I gain confidence? Well, once again, you gain confidence by doing well.
Right. One thing, I guess, where that connects to the pride is pride is something you can get by, you could subdivide the task into various things. So you could say like, okay, I did not run well that race, but I had a really good start. Or I didn't run that well, but I stayed with this person for that. Or I didn't do well, but you can think of any number. You can subdivide into 100 tasks and think, well, I did these things. And then even if you don't do well overall, you can start, I think, to build that confidence, because you say, well, I'm a little proud that I was able to do this and I didn't think I could.
I love that. As a coach, I use this. So one of the things, this recently happened with an athlete that I worked with, had a race, didn't do as well as they were hoping. And we started looking at the metrics. I'm like, your cadence was perfect. We've been working on cadence for a year, and this was the best cadence you ever had. Check, right? There's a confidence there and a building there and a pride that we've been working on this and we were successful. Now, was the race a success? No, but that one piece was. And I think if we can parse that out, even in triathlon, right? I had a really good swim. Like my swim was the strongest. Yeah, I didn't do the rest as good as I want, but I really do think that parsing these things out can help build confidence. I love this.
Yeah, I like to, and that's great. You do that coaching. I think one other piece you can do, and this is what I finally ended up at work with my son, was saying, look, you're in a win-win situation. You're going to do some things that will give you pride, but if there's nothing that can give you pride, you're going to learn something about like what didn't work, and think about what you learned. And he really took that to heart. He like started watching what he was doing, and he would say like, okay, that was terrible. You lost in this mile race you shouldn't have lost. What did you learn? And he said, I learned that I thought I was going to let him pass me, and then I'd run on his shoulder and pass him again. But as soon as he passed me, I would drop back. And it's like, okay, you remember that for next time. And it was really true. The next time he was going, he'd be on the last lap of the mile. Somebody would try to pass. He would fight him off, right? Because he knew that he'd get passed. And when he fights him off 3 or 4 times, the guy gave up and he won. It's like, good. This was a win-win. That other thing before, that's good. If you didn't get pride, you get knowledge. And you say every contest, you're either going to get a certain amount of pride, dividing it up into these things, or even if you got none, you're going to get this knowledge. And that's really good too.
Well, I love this. And one of the most important things for racing is getting to the start line healthy. And we always talk about, from a physical perspective, we always say, get to the start line with no injuries. And that's going to give you your best chance to have a great day. But I'm rethinking this now through this conversation is you've also got to get to the start line mentally healthy. And something Ted and I talked about right before this call was the week leading up to the race and everything that's going on. I mean, where does that enter into this discussion about mental skills during an event in terms of what happens before the event, before you even get to the start line?
You might in let's say like the 2 months leading up to it. And so I did this for a while with my DC cop framework. I try to say, like, let's see if there's any kind of thing I could do that circumvents the pain or this or that income. If I make a shorter stride, will that do it? No. If I do a longer stride, would that do it? Like, oh, maybe, and then I would say, is there anything that I could overcome? And I would try out different sort of songs or different chants, right? And then, is there anything I could do to persevere, right? And like one thing I would identify is making deals with myself. I would say, all right, I will keep up this pace up until that, and then you can do what you want. But you just have to do this. So if you just did that, making deals with yourself, I learned, like, okay, that's a way of perseverance would work, right? So you go into it like, all right, I know some of these things beforehand in my toolkit. I think that's one of the things that's good. But it's also good to keep in mind, like, I'm just going to watch what happens to me and notice it. Whereas it's easy not to notice it and not to think about it again. But if you go in thinking, I'm going to learn something, no matter how poorly I do, I'm going to learn something. You start thinking about, what is it? What am I going to learn?
I'm taking notes here. This is fantastic.
I love the whole learning thing too. So
that's exactly what I'm writing down.
John and I have talked a lot about going into a race when you don't feel like you're as fit as you could be because of whatever reason, right? Early season race, you've had an injury or whatever the case may be. And some people shy away from racing when they're like that. I don't usually shy away from those races, and I try and get my athletes not to either. But not because of this, but I'm taking notes too. I'm like, I think this is the thing, right? It's like, we're going to do this race not 100% fit. What can we learn? Like, what can I take away from this race? What can I learn? And as soon as you finish the race, like, write down, like, what did I learn here?
There's always something. It's like, oh, okay, I thought I could do this, but I can't, or I thought this was my strength, but it isn't here. Or this is actually the thing I do well, the cadence.
Yeah, and just trying something different, right? We just talked about as well as is in triathlon, because we're really doing 3 different sports. Maybe you try something different. Maybe once again, it's cadence on the bike, or it's a position on the bike, something that's a little bit different, that you're using this once again as a learning process. And the win is, did you learn something?
Yeah.
I love this. Very interesting.
Yeah, it's a very personal journey, I guess, to build these skills. But it does take some intention to try to get better skills in coping during a race, or to get the most for your performance.
Yeah, no, it's very personal, and I don't. It's really not a one size fits all. What the thing is that's going to circumvent, overcome, or persevere is really different for each person.
Todd, this has been fantastic. I have really enjoyed this discussion, or listening to you and really chatting about it. Ted, do you have some more questions at this point?
I'm overwhelmed by stuff here. So honestly, Todd, I just want to thank you, because I think you made both of us better triathletes, and for me, you made me a better coach tonight. And really, like, put some different thoughts in my brain. I'm actually racing next weekend at a half Ironman down in Mexico, and I'm going to be like using some of these strategies. In particular, thinking about the pride side.
Yeah.
Like, for me, like, I really think, like, personally, you put something in a little something in my brain that I think is gonna help me get through that race.
Let me know how it works.
I will. And then I also like the idea of, and I'm going to just kind of keep this in my brain as well, is like the pain thought side of things, is like really thinking about, because John and I talk a lot about pain in racing, and because it is, I mean, it's a contest of like of pain, is really thinking about maybe how to avoid the pain in the beginning, especially earlier on, so you don't have to cope with it as much. And
Yeah,
it's something
and
that
that's something we haven't talked about, because the other side. I mean, I think there's really two main aspects to like the mental abilities. One is toughness, and the other is strategy and strategic stuff. And that's the whole different thing, right? And there are certain strategies that are really, really going to be helpful, and that's just a different thing.
Yeah, awesome. Well, Todd, thank you so much for your time. I hope we can have you on again and maybe go down that strategy road. Now that you're learning more about triathlon. So this was really enjoyable. So thank you very much for your time.
Yeah, thanks so much, Todd. This has been fantastic. I'm glad we connected. Have a great evening, and thanks, everyone.